In this video, I'm going to explore what I think are two of the most overused and misunderstood words that get thrown around in the entire psychedelic discourse. Ego, death. And I assure you up front that it's not my intention, but I'm probably going to piss a few people off here because some folks get very precious around this topic in some kind of quasi-religious manner. For some, it's a way of validating psychonaut credentials. For others, it quantifies how enlightened they are. No, I'm not trying to upset anyone, but let me just put my cards on the table and I'll explain my position. Ego death is not the be-all and end-all of psychedelic experience, and most people who are seeking ego death have no comprehension of what it is that they are actually looking to achieve or what the end result of that will realistically look like. And so they look to this perceived pinnacle of killing the ego as something to aspire to that will bring instant peace, happiness, and fulfillment. Further to this, it's my experience that those who broadcast their ego death experiences, usually as a qualifier of how enlightened they are, they tend to be among the most egotistical people you will ever encounter and throw around the word ego as an insult to those who they see as beneath them in the spiritual hierarchy. Your ego is preventing you from comprehending ideas originating on a higher spiritual frequency. I doubt you'll ever get there. Yeah, the irony in statements like this is pretty amazing. Now, I'm genuinely not looking to try and shit on anyone or their experiences, nor am I saying that ego death experiences don't exist or that they have zero value. Rather, I'm just trying to dispel some of the woo and misconceptions around the ego and the pursuit of ego death as the ultimate endgame of psychedelic experience. Now, possibly some of what I just said will be triggering to a few people, and some of those are already ravenously clawing at their keyboard to tell me, "You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You clearly have never experienced true ego death." And to those people, I say this: that emotional wave that's flushing through you, urging you to tell me how wrong I am, that is literally your ego, and it's feeling a teeny bit bruised. So maybe that ego death you thought of taking you to the next stage of human evolution, yeah, maybe it didn't really hit the spot. Just something to keep in mind. So if you're interested in a rational and hopefully entertaining explanation of these topics, then make yourself comfortable and let's talk about ego death. As always, I will kick off with a few disclaimers. I'm not making any claims to scientific or psychological truth here, if indeed such things even exist around constructs such as ego. What I am trying to do is frame the fuzziness of the subject through a rational lens, using words in their literal sense to try and cut through the bullshit. I do this based on my personal experiences with psychedelics and by applying concepts that I've learned from people who I'm lucky enough to call friends, like neuroscientist Dr. James Cook, traditional Shipibo shaman Wheeler Noriega, and Jungian psychoanalyst Mackenzie Amara. And yes, I absolutely acknowledge that I'm name dropping here to boost my credibility. I mean, well, yeah, I totally am. But what my conversation with these guys does show is that there is something that we can define behind these concepts, which is important because otherwise phrases like these just become meaningless noise. So let's condense this ego death stuff down into something tangible. And from this, we can see whether we're actually talking about the same thing when we refer to ego or ego death. And yes, I will state just for the record that I have experienced ego death. And not to be flippant about it, but I simply view it as another experience, although certainly a very intense one. It's not something that validates or defines me, it's just an experience. And as with everything else that I talk about on this channel, I'm of the opinion that the experience itself means nothing on its own. In fact, it's next to useless unless you can do something with it, unless you can integrate it back into your life. Going to church doesn't make you spiritual. Taking psychedelics doesn't make you enlightened. And having an ego death doesn't mean you are free from your ego. All these things can certainly be stepping stones along the journey to those goals, but in no way are they the entirety of that journey, nor the goal itself. An experience is just an experience. The ego. So simply blind fetishizing ego death doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But before we go any further, it might be useful to define out what we actually mean when we talk about the ego. And to help with that, I'm going to bring in someone who is an expert on such concepts. My good friend and professional Jungian psychoanalyst in training from the International School of Analytic Psychology in Zurich, Mackenzie. So let's see what she has to say on this topic.
Ego is the center point of all conscious self. So everything that one knows about oneself, the ego is the centering point. That can be seen from two ways. It's both the thing that you most identify with, it's like the hat that you most frequently wear, and the beam of light that you can use to shine like a tool at the other aspects of your consciousness. So I could take my ego and shine it on my relationship to mother, for example. Okay. So I use the ego in a kind of directed way through my own volition. One of the words that does need to be really clarified in kind of talking about these two worlds is the word consciousness. Because in the psychedelic world, we use the word consciousness as the fundamental underlying isness animating all of reality. Yeah. It is a universal base truth that is indefinable and ineffable and exists everywhere a priori perennially. And Jung would say, and interestingly so would some Advaita teachers like Nisargadatta, that consciousness is always only ever conscious of something. Okay. So consciousness is not a base fact. Consciousness is a subject of an object, or an object of a subject. Okay. That awareness is that there is an a priori something. Jung would call it the secret order. He also uses the word pleroma, which comes from Gnosticism. He uses the word self with a capital S a lot. Nisargadatta or Advaita teachers would say awareness, but that consciousness is conscious of something. Okay. Which is where the ego comes in. The ego then becomes the director of consciousness. Yeah. It's the light of the flashlight. So the flashlight is consciousness, ego is the light. Where do I want to shine the light of my consciousness? And you can shine that on inner figures, i.e. on unconscious things, to kind of lift them up, which I think is what happens in the psychedelic space, is that your own inner shit or angels, like be them good things or bad things, get lifted up into the light of consciousness. You become aware of them.
I like how Mackenzie describes the ego as a lens through which we filter awareness. And it drives home a very simple truth. That lens is always going to be there for as long as you are going to be alive. If you did not have that lens, then there would literally be no you. You would have no identity. In simple terms, your ego is the part of your psychological makeup that amalgamates all your wants and desires and incentivizes you to carry out those actions in service of those desires, even if the actions themselves are contrary to our overall goal, and more on that later. Everything from how we present ourselves, how we want others to perceive us, and how that influences the way we interact with people. This is all coming about as a function of the ego. An example here would be, let's say, someone who wants to be seen as a communicator of human experiences in a concise and rational way. Are we talking about me? Okay. And so let's say to fulfill that desire, this hypothetical person makes a YouTube channel to try and frame those ideas, and perhaps in doing so they get a bit of attention, which is gratifying and encourages them to continue to make such videos. This is me, isn't it? So the ego in itself isn't inherently a bad thing. In our example, the desire to express oneself creatively isn't negative, nor is the desire to put one's thoughts out into the marketplace of ideas. So what's the problem with having an ego? Why is the word ego thrown around like an insult? And why are so many budding psychonauts in such a rush to kill their egos? Well, that's kind of my point. Having an ego isn't a bad thing. We all have one, whether we admit it or not, and it's a fucking good job that we do, because without it, none of us would likely be here to even talk about it. The problem with ego is that just like many parts of our human experience, it can get out of balance and start to look for gratification just for the sake of it. And it can prevent us from acknowledging things which might be true, simply because we aren't prepared to back down on a point that we've planted a psychological flag in. So back to our earlier example of the YouTuber. It's possible that they get so addicted to the gratification of YouTube that it actually overtakes the very thing that people liked in the first place. And I think we've all seen this with people who sell out or celebrities who disappear up their own arse. And yes, I'm sure I'm going to have my own moment of reckoning with this. It doesn't take much to overinflate someone's sense of ego. Personally, I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I certainly don't think I'm immune to it. Still, that doesn't stop people throwing the word ego at me anytime I say something they don't like. Check your ego, bro. Your ego is out of control. This kind of comeback or put down is pretty common in psychedelic discourse from those who view themselves as enlightened, and I find it particularly lazy. You know, if I'm having a disagreement with someone online, then, sure, it's completely possible that my ego is indeed out of control. But it's also equally possible that they're just a complete bell end. So, as we've discussed, we all have an ego. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can get out of control. And so the idea of cutting through those layers of bullshit that we believe about ourselves, yeah, it starts to sound appealing. And of course, this is something that psychedelics can certainly deliver, although not quite as often as the online discourse would indicate, and not quite with the simplistic results the New Age crowd would have us believe. Ego death. Ego and ego death are so completely overused and often misapplied phrases within the psychedelic community that there is actually an entire subreddit dedicated to taking the piss out of us. It's called Drug Circle Jerk, and to be honest, it's fucking hilarious. In this sub, ego death is mockingly referred to as eagle death, or igloo death. Well, what can I say? It's childish as fuck, and for those of us who don't take ourselves too seriously, it's very funny. And as I've said many times on this channel, not taking yourself too seriously is actually a very good way of keeping yourselves grounded. It's no surprise that those people who are unable to laugh at themselves are usually the one with the biggest egos. So let's get into how people misapply ego death. The first is that people substitute ego death with being incredibly high. And this is particularly the case around DMT with its legendary breakthrough experiences into what feels like another dimension. And some people think there is no difference between ego death and a psychedelic breakthrough. Those people are completely wrong. You can absolutely experience a fully featured alternate reality with crystal pyramids and alien entities and still 100% feel like you. This is something Terence McKenna often talked about.
One of the things about DMT that's really puzzling is, in a sense, it doesn't affect your mind. In other words, you don't change. DMT doesn't lay a hand on the judgmental machinery. You break through into that space exactly who you were before breaking through.
Now, that's not to say that you cannot have an ego death experience on DMT. I definitely think that you can. But the experience itself is so rapid that you can't really compare it to what is possible on other psychedelics. You don't really get any time to comprehend what's happening. You're simply yanked from one state of consciousness to another on some kind of cosmic roller coaster. The point is, though, that a breakthrough is not necessarily an ego death. There's also some confusion around ego death meaning a bad trip, or that just because you had a vision of dying, you experienced ego death. Again, this is not necessarily correct. You can absolutely have awful visions of torture and your own death without that leading to an actual state of ego death. So what is an ego death? It's a state where the construct of you ceases to exist, but consciousness continues to experience itself. Using myself as an example, Rob is no longer there as a concept. It's just experience in its purest form. Now that might sound quite nice and desirable, but it can also be incredibly destabilizing. We're basically talking about the rug being pulled out from underneath everything that makes you, you. And when you experience it, it isn't you. It isn't Rob. That's the whole fucking point. And that's incredibly hard to grasp if it hasn't happened to you. It's like consciousness is over there, but Rob is way back there somewhere. And this is part of our problem with our human-centric perspective. And you see this a lot in like religious circles. For example, when Christians talk about death, as in actual death, and then they like ascend to heaven, they tend to imagine it as their earthly identities in some kind of paradise. Likewise, when we tend to imagine ego death, we think of some kind of state of bliss and fulfillment, but we're doing that through the lens of us experiencing it. But that's not what it means. You are not there to experience it. And it takes you to come back into you, back into your identity, back into your ego, in order to be able to do any kind of processing on what the fuck just happened. Which is another one of my pedantic hang-ups over this phrase, ego death, because death implies some kind of permanent change of state, which is clearly not the case, or at least you should pray that it's not the case, because if you don't come back, then you're kind of screwed. This is why I describe it as just an experience, because in itself, it's neither good nor bad, it just is. And whether or not you get something beneficial from that experience is entirely in the hands of your ability to process it. You know, maybe you can just brush it off as some crazy shit. Maybe it's the most profound experience of your life. And maybe it's the thing that makes you come undone. I also want to dispel some of the bullshit around getting to these states. It's not some exclusive club. You don't need special training to experience ego death. I mean, I certainly didn't. It was something that happened to me completely unintentionally. Next is that it's like an instant win. It's not, and as I've mentioned before, it can be incredibly destabilizing. If you've ever seen someone completely lose their shit on psychedelics, then it's not a pretty sight. And I'm not talking about someone freaking out, I'm talking about someone completely losing their shit. If you lose your ego, you lose that firewall between unfiltered, raw awareness. And yes, that can be liberating, but it can also be fucking terrifying. That said, it's not as common as what you might think. I would say that ego deaths are a very rare experience. Out of all my trips, a lot of which involved quite high doses of ayahuasca or mushrooms, I would say that I've experienced true ego death maybe twice. In this way, it's similar to the mystical experience, where psychedelic researchers make a clear distinction between people having a psychedelic experience and having a full-blown mystical experience. There's a chapter on this in Michael Pollan's Change My Mind, and I would agree with this based on my own experiences. Some of my trips are just trippy, and some of them do have a different feel to them which invokes a sense of the sacred or spiritual. And further to this, I would say that the actual ego deaths are an even smaller subset of that. And again, in terms of what this experience actually does for you, it's not the be-all and end-all. My ego death experiences were not my most favourite trips, nor were they the ones that I got the greatest insights from. So I really want to make the case that this is not something to get hung up on. It's like skydiving. You can do it and get something out of it. You can do it and absolutely fucking hate it. For some people, it will have more significance than others, but for those who have never skydived, well, I mean, it's not like you've really missed out. It's not a quintessential part of being human. It's just an experience. Closing comments. So, how to wrap all this up? To those who are craving this ego death experience, I'd advise you to really think about what it is that you're looking for. In most cases, it's some form of peace and happiness. And if that is achievable while you're in this bodily form, then it's going to happen through the filter of your identity, through your ego. Maybe what you need is not actually ego death. Maybe it's ego strengthening. I can certainly see the appeal in the idea that one night of psychedelic turmoil is going to open the doors to nirvana, but that's not realistic, and pretty much anyone who has been through it, anyone who isn't a pretentious twat that is, will tell you that ego death is not a magic bullet for the struggles of existence. So don't get too hung up on getting this particular stamp in your psychonaut passport. It can certainly give you some stuff to think about. I mean, that's probably the understatement of the year. But ask yourself, if that's what you really need, do you need more stuff to think about? Not inner peace, not oneness, just more fucking stuff to process. And to those who've already been there, just remember that it doesn't make you any more enlightened, awakened, or conscious than the person sitting next to you. Use the experience to challenge yourself, find some humility, and question what the experience actually did for you. Did you put it to some good use? If so, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear all about your own experiences with ego death. I think that's about all I've got to say on this subject, so I hope you found something useful in there. And for anyone who thinks I'm completely full of shit, then that's fine. I'm just a flawed ego trying to shine that spotlight of focus around my own thoughts and understand this stuff as best as I can. I know it's something that gets said at the end of every video, but I really do want to say a big thank you for those of you who watch and engage in the conversations on these topics. This channel is about to hit 10,000 subscribers, which is just nuts and way beyond what I thought was possible. So again, thanks so much for watching, and a special thank you to my supporters, patrons, and those who contributed artwork or helped out through some other means. And if what I'm doing here resonates with you, then like, subscribe, share it with like-minded folks, or use it to annoy that guy you know who took mushrooms once and now thinks they know the meaning of the universe. So that's it, stay safe, stay grounded, and I'll see you next time.